What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Not all unions are our friends. Some unions, like police unions and prison guard unions, are effective at using some of the structures and messages of the labor movement, positioning themselves as interested in the health and well-being of their workers. And in doing so, they are stealing the valor of unions that are forming around Amazon workers or Starbucks workers and around nurses unions and teachers unions. But of course, cop and prison guard unions, and in some cases, architects, urban planners, construction trades unions like carpenters, they are lobbying for a world with more prisons and more prisoners. Here in California, the CCPOA, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, unfortunately, it is considered to be the most formidable union in California. The word peace, of course, should not be in there. These are people who are overseeing the mass caging, overseeing the sexual assault, torture of a lot of people who are inside. Erica Meiners co-founded Critical Resistance and is a friend. We've collaborated on a bunch of pieces around imprisonment in the past, a bunch of writing. She teaches in Chicago, both at Northeastern Illinois University campus, and also to people who are currently incarcerated in Illinois. Her last book was with Gina Dent, Beth Ritchie, and Angela Davis, Abolition Feminism Now. Erica just collaborated with Priya Kandaswamy, who is at San Diego State in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department. Her work is around race, gender, sexuality, and class. She deals with them in relation to state violence. And they collaborated on a piece recently at Truthout. It's called Prisons Are Anti-Labor Institutions. We need an anti-carceral labor movement. And the piece, I think, is extremely convincing. If you needed any proof of why anyone in labor organizing needs to recognize that prison guard unions and cop unions and the like are the opposition. And so if you are doing labor organizing, move accordingly. And I need to add a trigger warning for discussion of and also for me sounding a bit like someone who doesn't believe that prisons could and should close today. Listening back, I sound a little bit like a liberal devil's advocate, and I think you'll see what I mean. For people who don't know, how did a prison guard labor strike result in the deaths of 7 people in New York State recently?
The prison guard strike that happened in New York State is kind of in late February, early March. It was a wildcat strike, so not an official strike, but people walking off their jobs. One of the key demands around it was in relation to New York State's HALT Act, which is an act to limit the use of solitary confinement. In addition to like other demands, one of the key things that the guards were asking for was that essentially that act be repealed. And I guess we can talk a little bit more also about the politics of that, but just like kind of to get to your question, you can think about these prisons where people live already in very precarious circumstances. When people walk off their jobs, it meant that folks were, locked in their cells almost all of the time, that they were frequently not getting their meals even, that they were denied medical access. They often weren't getting medications they might have needed, right, to survive. They were denied visits or contact with loved ones. They were denied any kind of programming. They were frequently denied even like the ability to go outside, so you can think about like these conditions as producing both like a physical health and mental health crisis for folks. People in prison are already kind of in a physical health and mental health crisis, right? So like exacerbating that. So when you look at the deaths, some are the result of medical neglect. Some are the result of one of them. I think the one that got the most attention was Messiah Nantwi, who was beaten to death during the strike by a group of guards who were still on duty. And, there's like testimony from folks inside that, National Guard essentially just turned away and didn't do anything about it. There's also, right, this kind of like, I don't know, exacerbated violence, right, against people in this context. There's actually a report that just came out by the Legal Aid Society in New York State that documents, right, a lot of the experiences of incarcerated people during the strike. And so, like, and I would really encourage folks to take a look at it because in addition to 7 people dying, I think, right, like it's important to talk about like the amount of stress and danger and just the horrific conditions that like everyone who was incarcerated in those prisons experienced and like the tremendous threat to like the safety and well-being of those people, right, that the strike caused.
Yeah, we'll link to that report in the show notes for sure.
I'll just add to Priya's brilliance and thank you, Toshio, for all the rad journalism you do and for covering this issue and talking to us today. I just want to add that kind of building on Priya's last point that guard labor is about holding up institutions that, really are predicated on people's death, right? So there's no transparency or accountability about what unfolds inside. Like I think about in my state where I live right now, Illinois, about 200 people die every year in state prisons. So even though that there's like 7 reported deaths during the strike, do we know that? What are the, often the causes, like when we were doing Freedom of Information Acts in my state, trying to get information about the cause of death, the information the state would release is sometimes like somebody died of schizophrenia, right? As Priya was saying, the conditions during the strike, and my state, Illinois, just had like a prolonged kind of work stoppage, work actions by guards in retaliation toward the proposed prison closures in my state, and no movement for people inside, no visits, like, just exactly what Priya was outlining. So that those are the kind of exacerbated conditions, but the status quo is also premature death, right? As one of our comrades says. I think we want to look at the 7 deaths and ask questions about that. Like when they say self-harm, really, is it self-harm? It might be, but just trying to be suspicious and skeptical of the kind of data that the state and prisons make available because there's really no accountability or transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. For people also who might not know, could you speak to how much power that these prison guard unions wield in places like Illinois, here in California, and in many other states? And in addition to that, like, why do corrections budgets, you see the same thing with cop and military budgets, why do they avoid the austerity that we see in so many other areas?
I think, yes, carceral unions, I appreciate, Toshio, you kind of reminding us like about policing unions. I mean, they have an incredible amount of power. I mean, I think corrections officers unions, I think in my state, they lobby, right? I mean, Priya can talk a lot about how much money that the California Guards Union contributes, which I think is important. But also, I'm contrasting that with like the teachers union in Chicago that just settled a strike. And the teachers union, every machination of that is always like vilified in mainstream, media outlets. And everything about the union is kind of under scrutiny. And there's, tons of media coverage. Guards unions are, kind of exempt from that kind of critical, in my state in particular, that kind of critical scrutiny. And I think that's really interesting considering the kind of the membership, the power, the weight of it. I also think there's a way in which in politicians, stakeholder, the general public, spaces that those carceral unions, in particular, police and cops and guards, they're often seen as sort of synonymous or related to like safety and justice, right? And I think that's really a kind of a failure of the imagination of our people who are engaging in statecraft and policy, but also the general public. It's just that, of course, like these are kind of de facto common sense. These are unions that are making our streets safer, our communities safer. So I think that kind of lock gets reinforced, from our 24 hours of like Law and Order shows, from our lack of critical scrutiny in mainstream media outlets, right? About, how these unions work, in comparison with other unions, nurses unions or, in my state, teachers unions, right? I think that, the power of unions, they mobilize people. In my state, we've had this kind of prolonged, worksite action by the guards over the last, almost year, kind of pushing back on the proposed prison closures in my state and, trying to get more money into the corrections budget. They're organized, right? They're, an organized, body of workers. And then, maybe the last point about the power of those unions is that there's something about like race and space. I think where the prisons are situated in Illinois, those towns, right, are, I mean, often it's like the employment game in town. Logan Prison, which is a maximum security prison for people the state considers women. And in my state, Illinois, is proposed for closure because it has toxic, water, it has like falling down, it has mold, right? It's a shit show of a prison, right? But it's an economic engine in Lincoln, the town that it's in. And you drive in that town, there's rallies, signs, because that is still kind of an economic, public sector driver of that community. So I think that kind of holds those elected officials in that town kind of in grip. And I think it's also just sort of like a failure of the imagination of elected officials, of community people, all of us to kind of demand and imagine something different. So kind of scattered, but a couple of things.
No, yeah, that absolutely. Like, I think a big part of what you're saying that I'm always thinking about is like, how do we like the more progressive like vision of what constitutes safety, like that definition, out to more people? Like, does safety mean more correctional officers, more prisons? Or does it mean things like more money for education and healthcare and other things that we know like will preclude people from even the pipeline to prison? Priya, did you have anything to add?
Like, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, just building a little on what Erica was saying about the idea of public safety, I think another thing that like guards unions have done really well, and cops unions do this too, is like frame their work as dangerous, right? And also frame their work as like patriotic in some way as well. And so this like conversation, like even right, like in like the New York strike, like a lot of the conversation is about, well, we need to be able to use solitary confinement because that's a tool that keeps us safe at our incredibly dangerous jobs. That narrative really rests on, I think, a racialized imaginary about who is incarcerated and the idea that they are inherently dangerous and need to be controlled, and that like we need to give the people who do that controlling whatever they want so that they can do it because it's in the interest of the nation, right? And like that really is in like direct opposition to the reality that like the situation is that people who are incarcerated are the ones who are the most vulnerable to violence, and that violence is frequently coming from guards, right? Like so it's like this inversion. Even like in California right now, right? Like all maximum security facilities have been on lockdown since early March because like the CCPOA is manufacturing this narrative that incarcerated people, that there's been this increase in violence in maximum security facilities, and incarcerated people are responsible for it. And so we have to keep them like really like tightly controlled because they present a danger. And like we have that narrative, right? And that narrative doesn't take into account at all, right, what is actually happening, which is that violence is not increasing, and also that much of the violence that happens in prison, really all of the violence that happens in prison is constructed and perpetrated by the institution, right? Like even when incarcerated people act in violent ways, it is frequently because of the conditions that they're held in, right? Or because of the kinds of behavior that are sort of like egged on into, right? Like, so I think there's this narrative that like guards and cops do dangerous work to keep us safe that really needs to be like interrupted. And then I would also say, right, like in the California case in particular, right, I think a lot of people talk about the CCPOA as like this kind of case study in how, right, guards unions have been really like central to the expansion of prisons. So like in the early 1970s, there were like a little over 3,000 members to the CCPOA. And like today there are 26,000. And that growth is largely because, right, the CCPOA has advocated very strongly for the construction of new prisons, for get tough on crime laws, like, for example, California's three strikes law that led to longer sentences, harsher punishment, incarceration of more people. We can sort of think about this like cyclical process where like the guards union is growing itself and growing its political power through growing incarceration. And in the current moment, right, like what we see as there are more and more successful campaigns to close prisons, that I think guards unions have this kind of reinvigorated desire to, for example, in California, play a role in California politics, particularly through financial contributions to Gavin Newsom, right? And to, really try to curb prison closure or cuts to CDCR's budgets, even though it's been consistently recommended even by like state level budget analysts by using, right, like their political power to push for new kinds of initiatives that would continue to channel money into CDCR and continue, right, to maintain, right, both like guards employment, but also I think the larger sense of power of the guards union to wield influence.
Yeah, when you're framing it as like this sort of like patriotic duty that people are fulfilling when they go to work at this line of work, not something that I'm thinking about. Very interesting to hear about that part. In addition to that, like if you've sort of covered this in the last couple answers, but in the piece in Truthout, you quote from some people who have been in the prison and prison work for generations, and wanted to ask if you could describe for people why people do choose this kind of work.
I guess I think people choose it for a range of reasons. So I would say that like the workforce is different in different places and in different contexts. And I guess I kind of think of it as, this is maybe just my formulation, as like the spectrum between like, like some of the folks we talk about who like have worked in prisons for many generations, right? Like, and a lot of those examples were from places where like prisons are sited in white rural towns and they are generally policing Black people inside who are incarcerated. Like I think that a lot of that labor is driven by a kind of like white masculinist desire to, work in a place where you can enforce white supremacy, and that's not, while like the impetus to do the work might be economic, that's not a small piece of people's motivations. But I also think there is this sort of like other end of the spectrum of people who go into carceral employment because it appears like a good job, right? Because there aren't a lot of opportunities that pay comparably, that have the same kinds of benefits, that it also doesn't require a lot of education, and that it feels like this is something I can do to gain like upward mobility in some way. It's kind of one of the economic opportunities that is available to me. And I think that at that end of the spectrum, you see, like I worked for the college program at San Quentin for a hot minute. And like one of the things that was most surprising to me was how many women of color were guards, right? And particularly how many Asian women were guards. Like that was not something I expected at all. And also, right, many Latino women and some Black women as well. And I think a lot of those folks are there for very different reasons, right? Like they're there because we have a very precarious economy, right? It's hard to find well-paying work with benefits that you can live on and support all the many people who probably depend on you, right, economically. So like that's a really different logic. I think that like sometimes those logics maybe overlap and sometimes they're very different, but both of those things are happening to varying degrees in different places.
Yeah, we need to make it less attractive for people to be working these jobs that ultimately I think we want to phase out completely.
Yeah, I just want to really appreciate Priya's point about sort of like some people go to the work, because of the possibilities of racial violence, of transphobia, of doing those kind of practices. And I think there's like research about, KKK and racist supremacist groups, white supremacist groups in prison. So like I think about Southern Poverty Law Center and some of those organizations have done like kind of work on that. I mean, I started to kind of think about guard labor, and I teach at a working class public university, and I teach classes in a justice studies program, and those classes were always full, and there were people who were kind of on the track to, either working in corrections to try to support their families and themselves, or they were, looking to move up on the kind of guard ladder or the carceral industry employment ladder. Majority were men of color. And I think there's something coming back to sort of the point that Priya was making in the last question you asked about patriotism, about a gendered kind of patriotic kind of safety narrative that is like made available or seems, proximate through the kind of work. And then when I started to do work in some area prisons proximate to Chicago, the frontline workers, who weren't necessarily in my like working class public university classrooms in the kind of criminology, justice studies classes, but were, working at the prison, were women of color, Black women, Latinx women, who were certainly didn't sign up at age 11 to be a guard. That wasn't their future trajectory, right? But this was available, hiring. Can be a corrections officer in the state of Illinois with excellent benefits, paid on the job training. Starting salary is just under 50K a year, and so many opportunities for overtime pay, right? So it's a lucrative economic possibility, right? Yeah, I just want to lift that up.
One of the other pieces of this that you point out in the Truthout piece is another sort of negative for people who are going into this line of work are the mental health problems that associated with a job where people are basically tasked with being sort of like overseers. Could you speak to some of those problems?
A couple of layers here. One, capitalism, working is killing. Somebody who's tired at the end of my working day today, I feel like, work under capitalism is harmful. So the second layer is sort of, prisons themselves, as we've said a couple of different times and in this conversation, are kind of predicated on gender conformity, on white supremacy, on ableism, and the work of the guards is really to enforce the conditions of the prison. And of course, it has to be toxic for people. Clearly, incredibly toxic for people who are incarcerated. And we're not trying to have like a sort of a flatness here, like the
Right.
experience. The people who are incarcerated are the same as the experience of workers. So, that's not
Absolutely.
the case at all. It's got to be kind of killing for people, another kind of way. When we were kind of doing some research for this article, there was a kind of an uptick in kind of reports and proxy organizations, in particular in the last 4 or 5 years, kind of pointing to mental health, higher rates of mental health and self-harm for people who are working inside, higher rates of, sexual harm for, people who identify as women who work in prisons. I think we want to be both like hold that to be true. Of course, if those prisons are killing incarcerated people and are, reproducing transphobia, being violent towards incarcerated people, that kind of work has to be harmful for the person doing it. But also we want to be a little skeptical of this kind of recent uptick of reports and proxy organizations that is asking us, Priya mentioned it earlier, to kind of have like sympathy or compassion. I mean, because I think that's also like a strategic move in this moment to kind of talk about the working conditions of people inside and have attention to those working conditions. Because what do we need then? We need more resources and we need more staff people and we need more guards. We want to be a little, suspicious of that. And I started to get interested in this because I was, teaching at a working class college and I got so many people who really wanted to be guards in my classes. And I, started to talk to folks about what it was like to work inside, and many of them, the number one thing people talked about was like boredom, and exhaustion, which is the condition of, work under capitalism for many people, the kind of exhaustion from like either, kind of mandatory overtime shifts or, overtime shifts that they felt like were mandatory economically that they couldn't afford to pass up, but also just kind of sheer, kind of boredom for the work. Lifting up the question about mental health conditions, I think we want to, both, kind of acknowledge the obvious. These are, places that kill people, that's got to be, it's not the same, but, but it's got to impact the bodies that are doing that work. And also, we want to be very suspicious in this moment about how the working conditions of guards are being flagged, kind of strategically to kind of expand the footprint of prisons.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's useful somewhat for like, I don't know if people who are listening who have a friend or family member who is looking at this type of job as being lucrative, it's coming with all of these other negatives too that you need to point out to your friends and or family who are seeing this as like a potential job option. I also was, of course, happy to see that you have in this piece included some solutions that people have been trying out. Would you mind speaking to some of those?
I can start a little bit and I mean I think even just like in relation to the other question, we might think about like, like I kind of underscoring Erica's point that work under capitalism like is just toxic. The way in which like we can't imagine not being in work under capitalism, on the one hand, right, like one approach that I think is important, right, in the context that we're in is to think about, for example, prison closure and also what other kinds of work could people who work in prisons or who live in economies that are organized around prisons, like what other kind of work could become available in those places, and also to hold the question like, but like also how can we like not just be working under capitalism too seems important. Like I think, in the Truthout piece, one of the points is that like I felt like it was important for us to make is that like, public sector workers, who are not prison guards or cops, we still to a certain extent, right, some of us have large unions that have a lot of power. And like, what would it look like to start to use those unions to maybe be like a counterpoint to these guards unions, right? Like, I mean, guards unions have really effectively exerted a lot of control over the state budgeting process. And like those of us, for example, in California who work in higher education have certainly not been that successful at that, right? Like in terms of like just facing perpetual austerity, right? So I think that like what if as public workers unions who are really getting to the extent that a budget is a zero-sum game, right? Getting shortchanged because of all of the money that we put into carceral systems, what if we took on, right, prison closure as something that was important to, maintaining our livelihoods and the communities that we come from and the students that we serve and the people that we are, right? Like an understanding that, our lives, our jobs, our workplaces, like the things we have access to would be better, right, if we weren't putting so many resources into prisons. And I think you're starting to see some of that happen. Like, for example, in California, the California Nurses Association has like endorsed some legislation that is attempting to close certain aspects of prisons. And so like I think that's really positive. I think like having more conversation and political education within public workers unions to sort of reframe our struggles as not so much just about like our workplace issues or what gets seen as like bargaining issues and more about the larger contexts of our lives and the society we want to live in. So, like a more community-based union organizing has a lot of potential. But I think, right, like in a very practical sense, like for example, in California, I think the CCPOA is a significant barrier to closing prisons. Right. And so like one really like useful political strategy is to try to like counter their power, right? And try to think about what are ways that we could remove them as a barrier. And so I think that's like an important set of questions for labor to take on.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate, Priya's like reminder, like, why don't we have guaranteed minimum, income projects? Why don't we have free healthcare? Why don't we have free post-secondary education? So there's like all those things that might, redefine people's kind of choice of no choice, like about how they work. I think that is like things that we should be and must be kind of demanding and pushing for. As we're doing that, I think we also need to be getting those of us who are in labor unions, to be kind of following the lead of so many graduate student and other unions that kind of made the demands after the uprising of 2020. And actually, not just after that, like the writers union, I think demanded before that, to that AFL-CIO, divest from carceral unions, right? Like those aren't, flourishing future jobs. We shouldn't think about them as unions because they're predicated on the suppressed wage labor of people who work inside, right? How can they be labor unions when they're kind of suppressing the wage labor of all the people who are incarcerated who are doing the work to run those universities, right? So I think we need to kind of get our unions, our public sector and other unions to, pass a resolution in my little labor union, but it got defeated at the big one, in part because people felt like it was attacking a sibling union, right? So I think we need to do the political education to kind of get people just to sort of see the kind of labor unions, they aren't labor unions, actually. I think we also need to organizing people inside, workers inside, not because we simply want the end goal of people who are working inside prisons to have good working conditions and good compensation, but rather that's where working poor people are, right? And that's a strategy, an organizing strategy for a working class struggle, right? Is to make that demand and push and to support that, right? So I think that's a really, when that came up in our writing, I mean, I think it was also a line from you, Priya. I was like, yes, right, that makes so much sense, right? I think the other thing I just want to lift up in this moment, like looking critically at guards' labor unions, in a sense, this was a project kind of out of curiosity and necessity. Like Priya and I are public, employees who work at working class universities, and we were pissed off at our fucking budget cuts. And then kind of looking at that in states while there's like these kind of expansion of workers, other unionized workers in the carceral industries. And it's not like universities aren't killing machines of a different sort, but felt audacious to kind of like be like, oh my God, like I can't believe my state has $900 million as the starting price tag to build 2 new prisons. But, we're like scrapping, for our, the ceiling tiles are full of asbestos in my office and, no one cares. Anyway, now I'm on a rant. I'll just let that go. We need sort of ongoing kind of political education, and we need to think kind of structurally about the power of guards unions to engage in statecraft and policy craft. How are they doing that? How have they done that? I think it's a really important political moment that we're in post, rebellion of 2020, where some of these unions were on the back foot. And I think these strategies that Priya was talking about earlier, about thinking about continued mythology of carceral unions equals safety and justice, and we need to be concerned about the working conditions because all of our safety and justice kind of hinges on that, is an old script that they're kind of retrofitting in this moment. And I think we want to be looking critically at it. Why are we all paying attention to self-harm of carceral workers in this moment? So I think thinking structurally and systemically about the power of these organizations and where and how we can kind of shine a spotlight on it, but also kind of chip away at it.
That's great. Yeah, like just thinking about like how much positive vibes do these prison guard unions get? How much valor are they stealing from unions that are about educating people about like equity, about like fairness? These are not organizations that are aligned with the same things as like unions that I think when people hear unions, especially like on the left and people who will be listening to this podcast, like it's positive associations with it. That word reframing how we think about the quote unquote union that is like the prison guard union is really helpful. Last, I just wanted to, ask, is there a place that people can follow your work, or if you want to plug any groups that people should check out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are like, when we think about unions too, there are also like different models of like working class organizing. And so I always like to like lift up the organizing of like domestic workers unions, like the National Domestic Workers United, or right, like which are not traditional unions and don't exactly have like the same kind of collective bargaining rights that we associate with unions, but do like incredible work building solidarity across a lot of difference and like affecting really important transformations for people that are not just workplace based, but that are also much more community based, like similarly workers centers that have often like focused on the labor of like Asian immigrant women workers, or like immigrant workers in sweatshop conditions, or thinking about like day laborers associations, right? Like I want to say those things because I think those forms of labor organizing are really inventive and creative, and like also try to work with people not just as workers but as whole people. I think that's really important. And I also think, right, like a lot of those labor unions, right, are representing people who are also from the communities that prisons take their captives from, right? Like, and so I also really think that like it's important to think about like what kinds of labor organizing can happen in contexts of a lot of precarity, and how do we build power with people who work in much more precarious economic circumstances, because that's honestly the circumstances that we're all already in or heading toward as well, and I would say like I think there's like really great work that we could also think about in terms of like community members or family members of people who are incarcerated as like another really important organizing site, like people who do participatory defense work or folks that like do various kinds of support for inside organizing because they're personally connected to those people. And I think like all of that work is really important too.
The Chicago Teachers Union, just as offering a model of trying to shift a labor union away from bread and butter kind of agenda. And a group of people had a study group, took it over, and installed themselves and comrades, majority Black women leadership, and also elevated the paraprofessionals and the kind of marginalized workers within the union in terms of leadership positions, and shifted from being kind of a bread and butter labor union to being like pejoratively termed like a social justice unionism or common good unionism, but is like really saying, that, our working conditions are, students' learning conditions, and we're going to make demands for like to keep ICE out of schools, for housing, for housing, not just for workers, but for, the communities that our schools are located in. And of course, that's why it's attacked, has been attacked so strongly, across the city. There isn't just one thing, I mean, I think we are like looking at union organizing as flawed as a container as it is, as like one strategy to use in this moment. One of many, challenge and push back on and do the work to end the prison industrial complex and build more affirming communities. And so I think it's like one tool among many, and it's a tool that we haven't like a muscle we haven't flexed that much, or a tool we haven't used enough. So I've been like really energized by absolutely the National Day Labor organizing, National Domestic Worker organizing, also. I think the young people, who are fucking unionizing random Starbucks, at this moment, I just feel like there's a kind of also like a set of sense of glee about that kind of stuff. And I mean, I'm not like in the weeds. I don't really know, but I feel like that's an example. Or the fucking Amazon. I feel like now I'm swearing a lot, but it's the end of my day. The Amazon worker, like I feel like those are kind of models of that I think not models, but like just things that we can look at to take inspiration and also energy, and also just kind of from I hate the word models sometimes because it makes me think that people are gonna like we should do exactly like that, and I don't think we can.
Super useful information. A lot, and cursing, of course, is welcomed on this podcast. So no need to apologize there. I know it's getting late in Chicago, so I want to let you go. And thank you, Priya, for coming on, even though I know you're feeling a little under the weather. So yeah, just want to say thank you, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much for having us. It was, we really appreciate like the work that you're doing and the podcast and all of the different kinds of issues that you're raising on it. And, it's really like lovely to get to talk about this with you. So thank you.
Yeah, let's talk more. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/SadFrancisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early, and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.